Hello, everyone. I wanted to do a review video for the second ethical analysis. There's no associated assignment for this video. I will sometimes send out videos just on assignments or aspects of the course that I think should be commented on or explained or in some way talked about by me. So there's no actual assignment that goes along with this video. This video is just a review of what I was thinking of for ethical analysis too. And I think that this is a particularly important thing to talk about because this is the first assignment in which you will, I believe, you are demonstrating your knowledge of Kant and utilitarianism in an applied way. That is, looking at this fictional scenario and then not expressing your own opinion about it. This is not the idea of this assignment. The idea of the assignment was to apply Kantian and utilitarian principles to this fictional scenario to come up with some sort of answer from each point of view. This is something that you will be doing more in this course. So I thought it would be helpful if I told you sort of what I wanted from this. So the scenario itself is just it's the pretext for the application of these two ethical approaches, Kantianism and utilitarianism. This thing about Joe, who's a student who decides under a certain amount of pressure to cheat. He plagiarizes a paper and gets away with it. And how would Kant approach this? How would a utilitarian, along the lines of Mill? This is something we'll develop as we go on, what a utilitarian approach means, but I think we have the basics now. And this is just to apply that knowledge. Again, this is not your opinion. This is not a general assessment of it from no particular point of view. This is a very specific, number one and number two here really do ask you to approach this from a very specific point of view. So number one, what would a Kantian analysis of Joe's actions look like? First of all, let me say again, a Kantian analysis of an ethical situation is the application of the first two categorical imperatives. There is no Kantian analysis without that. So what you should have done if you hadn't is the application of each of those to Joe's situation. The first one, which has to do with universalizability. Can you will that your maxim of action be a universal law? If you can, then you know that what you're thinking of doing is ethical. If you can't, then you know that it's not ethical. So what we have to ask ourselves, just the application of this categorical imperative, the first one, is first of all what the rule of action is, maxim of action or rule of action is. And secondly, whether it can be willed to be a law for everyone. That is, it's not the golden rule, right? It's not I should only do that which I want others to do to me. That's not the first categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is whether or not, despite whatever feelings you may have, you can actually will that this be something that everyone should do, not to you, that everyone should do in general. And so we ask ourselves first, what is Joe's maxim of action or rule of action? And it can be put in different ways. In many ways, this is the hardest part in any Kantian analysis, is actually figuring out what the rule of action is, because there's never one choice. What I mean is this. We could say that, okay, Joe's rule of action is that if you are hard-pressed in getting an assignment in, that it's okay to plagiarize. That would be fairly specific. Or we could say Joe's rule of action is if you need to deceive someone, in this case, his teacher, in order to get something that you want, you should go ahead and do it. I think both of those would be plausible candidates for what Joe's rule of action is here, and there would be many more. So the choice you make in terms of what you think the rule of action actually is quite important. Because if we say, well, if we make the rule of action, well, if what you stand to lose is very great. Let's say your scholarship to school, and you have to cheat to some degree and deceive somebody in order to do it, but it won't hurt them, let's say, then you should do it. Now, if we make that a rule of action, then we're preparing for, yes, it's okay to do, right? But if we make our rule of action, well, in order to selfishly get what you want, it's okay to deceive another person, we'll probably say that that's not universalizable. You know? So we have to make our decision, first of all, and this is in any application of the first categorical imperative, about what the maxim, the rule of action actually is. So that's step one in application of the first categorical imperative. Step two is to ask ourselves, can we will that it be a universal law, that everyone act in that way, follow that rule in that sort of situation. And that's also not so easy, but what I want to emphasize is that this is you making the decision, right? You have to ask yourself, could I will that everyone act in that way in that situation? And you have to sort of ask yourself if you really could get behind that as a universal law, that everyone always follows that law in similar situations. And, I don't think just as I don't think there's one answer in terms of what the rule of action is, I don't think there's one answer with regard to any candidate, any specific choice about what the rule of action is. I don't think there's one answer about whether it can be a universal law. The important thing in this class, and I think the important thing in moral philosophy generally, is not what answer you have, it's how good your argument is for it. That is, if you just say, well, of course it can be, that's fine, you can will that. Well, you're just making a claim. Explain. Or if you say, well, no, you can't make that a universal law, well, explain. Right? This is where the emphasis is in this class. It's not about the moral positions that you take, which are more or less none of my business in the sense that they're your moral positions. What is my business is how well you argue for them, right? So if you say, under Kantian principles, we could never accept that as a maxim of action, yeah, you may be right, but why? The why is always here. So the application of the first categorical imperative, that's something you need to do a Kantian analysis. And obviously you need to apply the second categorical imperative as well. To really do a Kantian analysis, you have to do both, right? So the second categorical imperative, I think, is a little bit easier to apply, if not simpler to make a decision about. It's whether Joe would be using anybody as a means to an end rather than as an end in themselves. That's what the second version of the categorical imperative is. Always use other persons, always treat other persons, always as an end in themselves, never as a mere means to one of your ends. So is Joe treating any person like a thing in the sense that he's exploiting them, using them? That would be the second question. That is, if the answer is no, then it's probably ethical to do. If the answer is yes, then it's definitely not ethical to do. There's a very strong, I think, case to be made here. Again, I'm not being definitive about it, but I think there's a very strong case to be made here that Joe is, in fact, violating the second version of the categorical imperative because he's deceiving someone. He's handing his teacher a paper with the intent to deceive, and one may argue, and I think argue with a lot of foundation, that thereby he is using the teacher as a means, a mere means, and not treating the teacher as an end in themselves. So that's the way that a Kantian analysis would go. I think it's just the application of the first and second categorical imperatives. So, we're just getting started here. But I can tell you, if you didn't do that, just for the purposes of exams and things you'll write later on, if you didn't do that, you were doing it the wrong way. Because a Kantian analysis is the application of the first and second categorical imperatives. A utilitarian analysis, perhaps at this point, is a little less clear what it would mean, but we do have the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right or wrong insofar as they affect happiness and unhappiness, human welfare. An action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, Mill says, is wrong to the point, or insofar as it diminishes human happiness or positively causes unhappiness. So the main difference, obviously, from a Kantian analysis being that our analysis is now consequentialist. It is not about whether Joe's actions conform to a certain rule. It's about the results of Joe's actions. So doing a utilitarian analysis, I would say the first thing that we do in any utilitarian analysis is determine whose interests are at stake. That is, who is actually being affected by this action. It's the greatest happiness principle. But not everyone, practically speaking, is really going to be affected by Joe's actions. So we have to think about whose interests are actually directly at stake. Obviously, Joe, maybe most primarily Joe, but also Joe's teacher and perhaps the other students in the class and perhaps the university, college, that school that Joe's going to in general, but in varying degrees. So we just have to make judgments about the impacts that Joe's actions had and really compare them with other things, the impacts of other courses of action that Joe could have taken. So, but just look at what Joe actually did. Joe prevented, by his cheating, the loss of his scholarship and perhaps the loss of his place at the school. If he had done differently, he would have probably had to endure those impacts, those negative impacts on his happiness. Yes, he did. He definitely deceived his teacher. There's no doubt. But were there negative effects on the teacher? I mean, if the teacher never found out, that's one thing. If the teacher did found out, that would be a negative impact. How about the other students in the class? Was Joe's cheating? Did it negatively impact them? Well, in some sense of fairness or justice, perhaps, but did it really impact their happiness? Did they get lower grades as a result? Having not found out, apparently, about the cheating on Joe's part, did it really affect them? How much did it affect the university in terms of its integrity and standards? I mean, all these things need to be taken into account. And at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. I think almost all utilitarian analyses of ethical situations require judgment. That is, you have to judge, well, if we take all of the impacts, all the results of this person's actions, did they increase the happiness of everyone involved, taken as a sort of a net thing, or did they decrease it? And then we judge on that basis. I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's how I would go about it. There is no particular answer here. There's all sorts of things that I'm putting aside here in terms of utilitarianism. There are different forms of utilitarianism, but I feel like I am on some solid ground when I say that we are sort of approaching it through classical act utilitarianism. Like, did this particular act, Joe's cheating, Joe's plagiarizing, did it produce overall happiness, or did it produce overall unhappiness? That's a judgment call, but that's how we would go about it. We would look at the results of the action, try to make judgments about its impact on the welfare of everyone involved, and then make a judgment about whether that overall impact on their welfare was positive, increased happiness, or negative, decreased happiness or caused unhappiness. That's the way you go about it. Again, what particular position you take, from a utilitarian point of view, whether it was good or bad, it really doesn't matter. You need to argue for it, right? You need to explain why. So that's just what I had in mind in terms of this assignment. Again, there's no assignment associated with this video. It's just I thought it was important to go over it and let you know what I had in mind.